I'm Will from MBUK and I'm here with Tom Marvin, Senior Technical Editor. Tom, how are you doing?
I'm all right, thanks Will, how are you?
I'm very well. So we're here today to talk about cable routing. Why is it important and what should be done about it? Tom, what are all the cables on a mountain bike for and why is cable routing such a divisive issue?
Right, there's quite a few cables on a mountain bike, depending on your mountain bike obviously. Now the two obvious ones that every mountain bike is going to have is the front brake and the rear brake. Okay, so the front brake is just going to go straight to the bottom of your forks. Can't really do much about it, it's just going to flap there at the front of your bike. The rear one obviously goes all the way to the back of the bike too, but that can be routed either inside or outside the frame. And that's where the sort of discussions come in. The other cables that you might have on the bike, well, that'll be the rear mech, unless you're running SRAM's Access wireless drivetrains. And then if you've got a bike with a lockout, you might also have cables for the fork and or the shock. So the reason why it's such a divisive issue is, well, do you have the cables on the outside or the inside of the frame? And obviously there are benefits and costs to both of those.
What about dropper posts?
You've dropped me right in there. Yeah, dropper posts are on a lot of mountain bikes these days as well, and they also have a cable, unless it's one of the SRAM Access ones.
And that's what we're here to talk about today. What is internal cable routing and what is external cable routing and which is best? Which side of this debate do you come in at? Do you like internal cable routing? Do you like external cable routing? A mixture? What do you like?
I am entirely conflicted about this discussion. So I am not a big fan of working on my bike. I like to get a bike out the garage, go and ride it, come back, put it back in the garage and then not think about it until next time I ride the bike. But inevitably, sometimes I have to do some working on my bike. And if I'm working on a bike, whether it's replacing some brakes or changing a gear hose or fitting a new dropper post, I love external cable routing because it is so much easier, in my opinion, to work on 99% of the time. That said, I love the aesthetics of an internally routed bike because you can't see the cables and it gives really clean, slick lines to the bike. And there are some other advantages as well. Recently, I've been riding a Merida 140. It's my long-term bike in the MBUK magazine, and I had to change the brakes on it, and I was dreading the thought of doing this because the cables go, or the hose goes in the rear chainstay, through like the chainstay to seat tube, BB junction, all the way up the down tube, and then out of the headset, which is another discussion to have. And I was thinking, oh man, this is going to be a nightmare. To be fair, it took a little while because I was also doing the rear gears as well, but it wasn't as painful as I thought it was going to be. So it's kind of changed my opinion a little bit because it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, and that's another issue we need to talk about, which is noise.
Yeah.
Because if the cables are flapping about freely inside, especially the down tube, which is a big tube, it can add a lot to the noise.
Yeah, it can add a lot to the noise because, as you say, it rattles around. Now, there are some companies which will put little guiding points in there, or the entrance and exit will be sort of bolted and clamped to try and hold that hose or that cable tight. But a lot of the time what they use is like an external rubber sort of extra hose to go on your hose, if that makes sense, to sort of quieten those rattles down. And having worked on bikes with that in the past, that can be a real nightmare to fit. But it does work.
It does work. But do you think that your work on the Merida would have been easier if you just had the traditional external cable routing where you have a guide and you zip tie the hose onto the guide and you cut the zip ties when you want to take it off?
Undoubtedly. So I do our disc brakes group test every year, so I spend a couple of months fitting and removing brakes multiple times a day. And whenever I do this test, I always make sure I'm testing those brakes on a bike that has external cable routing. Otherwise, you just end up with zip ties on the outside of your normal bike frame, which doesn't look very tidy, and I do like a tidy looking bike.
You seem kind of conflicted, Tom. There's like points either way. So let's go through the advantages and disadvantages for the viewers.
Advantage one, I think it's a lot easier to route your hoses and route your cables and make sure that your hoses and cables are the right length. Advantage two, from a manufacturing point of view, it's probably easier to put a cable mount on the outside of an aluminium frame. So that kind of might impact on how expensive it is to build a frame, which might have an impact down the line on how cheap your bike is. Also from a cleaning perspective, you quite often get a lot of grit and like dirt and stuff down the back of the cable, so again that sort of impacts on how good the bike looks. If you've got full length cable outers, I don't think there's too much of an impact on longevity there, it's just an aesthetic thing really. So yeah, I'd say those are the two main pros and cons of external cable routing.
Well, we all love having our bikes looking beautiful, and many people go to great lengths to protect their paint. So what about cable rub? Is that affected by internal and external routing?
It is a little bit, and it depends how the cables are routed. So particularly if a cable is going into the down tube near the head tube, that's a real rubbing point. If you've got external routing, then actually it can be a bit easier to make sure that those cables don't rub when you're having that. Obviously, if you get it wrong, you get it wrong, and you can get it right with internally routed ones as well. So quite often you see bikes where the entrance to the internal cable routing is right at the front of the head tube. Santa Cruz, for example, do this, I'm pretty sure. And that really helps minimise that cable rub.
And are we seeing any developments in this area? So sheathing was something that when it came in, we thought, this is great, this will make cable routing internally so much easier. Have we had any more steps forward?
One of the things I've noticed in recent years is there's a lot more bikes where the cable goes in at the head tube and then you don't see it until right towards the rear axle, and that's because routing around the bottom bracket and then into sort of between the chainstay and the BB down tube junction is a lot smoother and a lot cleaner. Like on that Merida, Specialized have been doing that for a little while as well. So that's quite a nice development because it just keeps the whole bike looking a bit cleaner. In terms of ultimate cable routing, getting rid of the cables, SRAM access, that's the biggest development because all of a sudden you've got rid of your cables.
Okay, and what about your headset? Is there anything that's developing there that might change the game a little bit?
So we have seen quite a few bikes coming out, especially sort of either e-bikes or XC downcountry bikes, and actually increasingly on enduro bikes too, where the cable goes all the way up the down tube and then pops out through the middle of your headset bearing. Now there are various reasons for doing this. One, cleanliness. If you've seen the new Scott Genius, for example, possibly the cleanest looking bike, even with brake cables, because the cable for the rear brake goes under the handlebar and then goes in through the stem and down, and you don't see the cable. It's incredible. All you see is the front brake cable flapping around it. It's a little bit awkward actually, but it's just the front cable there. One of the reasons for going through the headset is that apparently it reduces the amount of friction and the amount of resistance to turning, so you get a slightly easier turning handlebar. It reduces the number of kinks potentially in the hoses, or there's less sort of bends and turns. And I think in the coming year we're going to see some changes to the brake lever architecture from some of the big brands that might sort of work nicer with routing going through the headset.
Well, Tom, you filled us in on, I think, everything to do with internal and external cable routing.
I've actually surprised myself.
Well, it is something that comes up a lot in the office.
It is.
And people talk about it a lot, as it's something that is developing in the mountain bike industry. Right, thanks so much for joining us today, Tom. I think we've covered basically everything you could possibly want to know or ask about internal and external cable routing. But if we haven't, let us know in the comments what you want to hear more about, and also let us know what your favourite cable routing is. So like, subscribe and leave a comment below letting us know what you want to hear more about on MBUK Opinions.